Welcome to Worship for Small Congregations. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars focused on how we can bring new ideas, new technology, and a new sense of even our musical traditions alive in our worship for small congregations. I'm the Reverend Matthew Crary, and I'm the presenter for this, the second in the series, about technology in our worship. Our host, Lori, will be providing all the tech so that this has been recorded. And the original webinar was presented and then recorded on October 9th. And this is following up on that. I'll begin us with a chalice lighting by John Ruskin. There is a religion in everything around us, a calm and holy religion in the inbreathing things of nature, which we would do well to imitate. It is a meek and blessed influence, stealing in, as it were, unawares upon the heart. It comes in quietly and without excitement. It has no terror, no gloom, and in its approaches, no fear. It does not rouse up the passions. It is untrammeled by the creeds and unshadowed by the superstitions. It's the poetry of nature, and it is this which uplifts the spirit within us until it is strong enough to overlook the shadows of our place of probation, which breaks in, link after link, the chain that binds us to materiality and opens to our imagination a world of spiritual beauty and wholeness. I have a special welcome and greeting to the individuals who were able to participate in a survey that was sent out prior to the recording of the webinar. And that's the individuals Ian and Fred and Harold, Susan, Lori, Janet, Joan, Nancy, and Ellie, and of course everyone else who joined in and was able to provide information during the webinar with polls and questions that were posed. So welcome, everyone. As I mentioned before, I'm Matthew Crary. I'm currently serving the UU congregation of Amado, Arizona. And here's just a few images of myself and my family to give you a sense of who I am briefly through some images as we begin. My interest in technology in our worship has for about 10 years been surrounded in the contemporary worship style. And if you caught Tara Little's first session in this webinar, you heard the definition of contemporary worship that includes contemporary music, contemporary technology, and contemporary approaches, imagery and messaging that we see in lots of different places. And I've been working on that for about 10 years. I have some experience with the Reverend Marlon Lavenar's Soulful Sundown, which I had an interest in right away when I heard he had created this style of worship for Unitarian Universalists and was able to offer to our Pacific Southwest District at our district assemblies for a few years running. And I have an interest in Matthew Fox's Cosmic Mass, sometimes known as the Techno-Cosmic Mass, which is an ecstatic form of worship that takes a very different style than what we're used to on our Sunday mornings. And in my 10 years in a variety of venues then, among Unitarian Universalists, have brought together these different types of worship and experimented and found some real interest and success among the congregations. But my personal story begins with an introduction to worship beyond that Protestant style of what was often called the hymn sandwich, which I was raised. And it was a story my father told me about the most effective worship that he had experienced. He mentioned it when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And for him, it was an experience in college of a jazz worship. And he described it the music and the message being one. And I was fascinated by this because it was quite different from the worship that I was growing up with. And oddly enough, years later, when I mentioned it to him again, that I had spent a great deal of time and interest and energy on different styles of worship because of what he had inspired into me, he didn't quite remember having that conversation, and even didn't remember that jazz worship. And yet, I'm still grateful for him sharing that with me, and I have enjoyed the different stages of learning about technology used in worship. The agenda that I have for this webinar is 3 parts. First, talking about technology as a medium, technology also as an invitation, and finally, technology is spirit, because our worship is a transformative experience that is spirit-filled if we have the invitations and the mediums set up to welcome it. Now, throughout this, I'm going to ask some questions, which I've received answers from the individuals who participated in the webinar, but would ask, if you're viewing this, that you take a moment or two to consider what type of technology that you have used today. Now, that could be all kinds of different types of technology. If you're viewing this video from online, you're using a computer, certainly, or a touchpad or tablet of some sort. You might have already used a cell, a smartphone, or even a landline. You may have used a camera today. You may have used a television or a radio. And there are lots of different applications to using our different technology today. But just consider all the different ways that your everyday utilizes technology for a moment. To say that technology is a medium really is referring to technology as a tool. That this image of our hand is very much the way that we interact with the world. And then the fork and the pitchfork are examples of how we have taken that basic interaction with the world and created tools to extend ourselves in different ways, to create a medium in which we can interact with the world. These mediums have both personal and societal impacts. As we can do more with tools replicating parts of our body and parts of our mind, parts of our hearts and spirits, as we do that, we can extend ourselves into the world and have some very serious and meaningful impacts. When we begin to look at worship in the Western tradition, you can see that there's changes in the technology and changes in the tools that have continued to extend the types of worship that we have into the world. And painting it in the broadest strokes, our worship really did begin with an oral tradition, where there were individuals who offered mythology and theology through story, through spoken word and speeches and sermons even, to small groups of people who, within the range of their voice, could hear and be inspired by their message. That was complemented very quickly with a sense of both art, a development of a sense of place in architecture. And these images depict some of the earlier stages moving into the cathedrals of the early Christian tradition, in which art begins to take on, and imagery begins to take on a meaning of its own and conveys that message in a way beyond the spoken word. So art becomes a medium and a tool. Language, beyond the oral, becomes written down. And here we have images of some of the earlier writings of different faith traditions, recording those stories and that theology as a new medium, a new tool to begin to extend the message out into the world. And of course, with the development of the Gutenberg printing press, you get the popularization of the Bible, the Christian text, and that begins to change the way that people socially begin to really interact. Instead of going to a certain place to hear someone within the range of their spoken word, or even get it in small text kind of situations, this allowed a much more popular understanding of scriptural texts. And that had a bigger social change. So along with individual experiences, we begin to see here that there are, through the tools of technology, social changes, large social changes. And in fact, much of the Reformation is attributed to this printing press and the popularization of the Christian scriptures. Jumping ahead, and because there was a large jump in many ways to radio broadcasting, was really the next tool that we see kind of coming onto and having an impact within worship. And this was allowing people to extend the spoken word well beyond just earshot. And this allowed people to hear and experience worship services at quite a distance. We also see in this big jump a big change within how people are experiencing the worship space. Worship being oriented around one location, and now worship through the radio broadcast being able to be experienced in the home. A shorter jump in technology, and yet another relevant one, was the development of the television broadcast, in which imagery was beginning to also play a part. And so picking up on the oral, picking up on art, picking up on even the written word, both radio and television begins to extend further and further the voice, the message. The medium gets further out into our society, and of course has a greater impact then socially than just on individuals who are attending or coming to one location for a worship service. And finally, technology as a medium incorporating the digital electronics. And here there's this giant analog computer compared to all the digital electronics, some of which you, when I ask you the question, we're probably thinking about how you use today. An interesting part, though, is that while early worship historically incorporated a lot of the different technologies that I've mentioned, when we start to move to the broadcast, we move further and further away from what's happening within our worship services, to a point where many congregations today don't experience the digital electronic age within their worship space. Now, certainly that isn't true across the board. And if you're listening to this, it's because you have an interest in adapting current technology to your worship. And that's mostly because it reflects your daily life. Just as you reflect on using a computer or a tablet or an iPhone or whatever technology that you've been using today, it's something that's a part of your daily life. And one of the ways that, we need to incorporate within our worship services is the very things that affect us on a daily basis. And so I'll be offering some examples of how you might begin to incorporate not just the digital, but also the television broadcast, the radio broadcast, how we can extend ourselves within our worship spaces so that it reflects more of our daily lives. And I take a lot of this thought and philosophy from Marshall McLuhan, who's famous for saying the medium is the message. He goes on to say that this is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, results from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. Or, to say it more briefly, technology is a medium to extend ourselves into the world. It's a tool that, in the most basic sense, even reflects the imagery of our very bodies. But as it gets further and further away from us and becomes more of a broadcast or a digital medium, in many ways, we have lost how to incorporate that in our worship. And I want to offer a couple of different ways that you can not only just reconceive of technology as a positive medium to extend ourselves into our worship spaces, but practical applications of that. But to pause again and ask another question about the technology that you've been using, how do you consider that to be an extension of yourself? For example, how have you today, using your phone, extended yourself into the world around you? And begin to consider how there's social impacts, there's certainly environmental impacts, and there may even be spiritual impacts of the technology that we use daily that may in fact be missing from our worship services. Technology is an invitation. The multiple intelligences are a way of understanding different methods of learning as offered by Howard Gardner. And much of his life work has been in defining these different multiple intelligences. Since I began my interest in contemporary worship, I have used these, and when I first started, there were just 7. Now there's several more, and he seems to be expanding them and testing some new areas. But these are the ones that I had offered the individuals who participated in the webinar to reflect on, both as part of their own experience, their own multiple intelligences, and how these come through in the worship within their congregations. And if you're not familiar with these, I'll briefly go through the different types of intelligences. Know, though, that I've named this part of this session that technology is an invitation because beyond just being an intelligence, I think that these are also invitations within our worship. And the categories that I'll be reading to you about, and I've adapted from the work of Carla Lane, particularly something about distance learning technology resource guide, but I've adapted it to share a little bit more about each of these intelligences. And so we'll start with the visual and the spatial. The individuals who carry this type of intelligence are aware of the space around them and the environment and are visually drawn in, sometimes through the just physical imagery that they can see. There's certainly the setup and layout of a worship space. And that can include anything from art to graphics, charts, photographs, video, multimedia, or even handouts. Your every Sunday order of service and bulletin is something significant to those with a strong visual intelligence. Next intelligence is kinesthetic. Kinesthetic individuals have a keen sense of body awareness and are engaged by movement, by creating things, and by touch. They communicate well through body language and can be drawn in through physical activity, hands-on learning, and even role-playing, even if they're not participating. Simply observing movement can draw in someone with a kinesthetic intelligence. And so kinesthetic worship would include movement, dance, dynamic ritual, and interactive objects maybe that's something that might even be passed around in your worship service. In some ways, when the offering is taken and a basket or some other item is passed, that serves to tell the kinesthetic people a great deal about the congregation and about how sharing is done among you. The next multiple intelligence that Gardner teaches about is the musical. So obviously, these individuals are drawn to music, but they're also very sensitive to sounds within their environment. They can be invited in simply with music or even sound effects that are played in the background as people gather, perhaps even behind a meditation. They can be drawn in deeper by lyrics, by speaking rhythmically, by tapping out time. Musical worship includes instruments, live music, recorded music, and or music videos. The logical intelligence or mathematic are people who think conceptually, abstractly, and are able to see and explore patterns and relationships. They like to experiment and solve puzzles, and also ask those big cosmic questions. They can be brought in and captured in worship by logic game, by investigations, and just by a sense of mystery. But the logical flow and pattern of a worship are elements which are meaningful to an individual who really has a sense of the logical and will draw them deeper into the experience. And in many ways, our Unitarian Universalist thematic worship, which is that non-scriptural, non-liturgical approach to worship, although because it's thematic, it's open to that, in which a worship, every element of the worship from the beginning through the end has some connection to a central theme and message, really creates a strong flow that the logical, mathematical-minded person is drawn deeply toward and can have a much deeper experience of worship through. The interpersonal individual is really deeply invited into worship through interaction. And they can be drawn in through group activities, shared rituals, and dialogues, the going back and forth. Again, they don't have to participate themselves as much as to see this occur or to witness it. They will be drawn in simply by watching worship that is an interpersonal experience. And this can be enhanced by direct attention from a worship leader, asking a question and getting an answer, by things like video conferencing, by writing, drawing, or even online surveys that you gather information before the worship even begins. And then the worship somehow reflects that information back. Yet another invitation and intelligence is the intrapersonal. Interpersonal individuals are in tune with their inner feelings. They have wisdom, intuition, motivation, as well as a strong will, confidence, and opinions. And this sounds, I imagine, very much like individuals you're well aware of in your congregations, if not yourself. They can be drawn in through contemplation, meditation, prayer, readings, sermons, really anything introspective. And so offering them the time to consider how they feel and their own thoughts and their own deep spiritual experience through silence, through contemplation, through offering them time are effective ways to create an invitation to those who are very introspective. The linguistic individuals have a highly developed auditory skills and often think in words. They like reading, playing word games, poetry, and stories, and they can be invited to deeper worship by encouraging them to say and see words in unison and in responsive readings. And so, of course, linguistic worship would include rituals, games, multimedia, readings, and sermons. And this is some place that we as Unitarian Universalists, inheritors of the Protestant tradition, really have great strengths. And finally, technology is an invitation to those who have a naturalistic intelligence. Naturalistic individuals are attentive to and nurtured by natural environments. They integrate their natural senses in evaluating and assessing new ideas and experiences. So while naturalistic worship most obviously would take place out of doors or bring significant elements of the outdoors indoors, you can also stimulate the naturalistic intelligence by the senses, the smell and taste, the textures, the sounds that individuals are hearing can reflect nature and really evoke a deep sense of the naturalistic among people. Now, one of the things that we did when we originally did this webinar was we invited people to fill out a survey, and here are the results. And this, of course, is a great example of how not to present information during worship, particularly if you're trying to connect with people and deepen their experience. This is much too much information to offer during a worship service. It's really too much for any type of presentation. And in one sense, I chose to do this as a negative example of what not to do. But another because you can also present information in a way that you can quickly see some differences. So all of the green dropping away, the average things sort of dropping away, and what really kind of pops out are the yellow growing edges and the blue strengths. So that this would be one way that you could present a great deal of information at one time. But instead, what I recommend, if you were to do some type of survey and then collate the data, is really break it down and offer people something simple, which is this. From the survey, I learned that people who responded felt average and strong, both in the analytic and the introspective invitations. That those invitations and intelligences, which were analytic, really helped us to analyze and understand the world, or very introspective, that's where we score well. And in fact, that's pretty common with Unitarian Universalists. But that the growing edge, the real area that congregations and individuals as Unitarian Universalists are really seeking within worship is the interactive invitations. Those different ways that we can begin to have our worship involve many more people. And of course, that's the wonderful thing about technology as an invitation, is that if you're inviting people in these different ways that they hold strong intelligences, if you're inviting the people in visually, that you'll deepen their experience and it'll be a much more welcoming and interactive worship to begin with. But before getting into the details and really offering you some very practical ways that you can begin to use these invitations in conjunction with technology, I do want to just pause and say that the most important thing and the most basic use of technology today is so that people can see and can hear our worship. If you've spent a long time creating a wonderful visual presentation and yet somehow your screen is too far out of the way or at an odd angle, or there's things standing in front of it, maybe there's a plant standing in front of it, you've created a situation where it's not really useful. People can't see what you're doing. And similarly, making sure that people can hear. And this is one way that the broadcast technology is very useful in our congregations. Wireless microphones, even cabled microphones, in which we have speaker systems and sound systems set up. Many congregations, if not all of our congregations today, have some form of sound equipment. And before jumping into any other type of technology, it's really important people can just simply hear. And there are some wonderful advances, very inexpensive advances in wireless technology and technology helping people who are hearing impaired. All of that is quite possible and really should be the first step of any group trying to look to deepen their experience of using technology in worship. And ideally, let's make sure everybody can see the presenter, see what you've worked so hard on. And so in many ways, like Tara Little mentioned in the first session of this series, this webinar series, preparation and practice becomes very important. Make sure that whatever technology you're using, people can see and people can hear. I really feel like it's so important that before we can use the invitations that we have, we really have to make sure that people can see and hear them. But to go right to those invitations and to offer you some of the ways in which I've discovered that these invitations really bring people deeply into the worship, beginning with that visual. Certainly images and colors, the use of space, and as I mentioned, where your projections even set up, can enhance things like this. This is simply a title page. When the congregation walked into the sanctuary, this is the image that they saw. It's certainly trying to set up the theme through the use of font and through the use of the optical illusion that the chalice is created by the space between these two faces. Font has a very powerful application in our visual medium. Certainly it has a linguistic application, but just the way the letters look often can really change the sense of just a word. This was part of a worship where I was bringing back the concept of covenant and felt like, wow, we've really kind of done this to death, so I want something exciting. And so I borrowed this from the Indiana Jones film series. Both of these fonts are a part of that. Now, people wouldn't even have to have known that to have something, this is an exciting, vibrant way to present this. But later in the service, I certainly went ahead and went there. Unitarian Universalists and the quest for covenant. Now, this brings up, I think, an important point when using imagery, and that's copyright. One of the things I do to recognize the creators of any particular image is I try at the end of the service to provide some sort of credits page. So providing acknowledgement to artists and photographers, whoever it is who has created that image, if that is not part of the image itself. Several of the images I've already shown you have the artist's name attached to it. And that's a way to give that recognition. But when it comes to copyright, there are some very interesting limitations and some liberties that we have during our worship time frame. And so I would direct you to our UUA website. And it's a quick Google search to just type in copyright and UUA. And what you'll find is some nice guidelines, some nice ideas about both those limitations and, of course, those liberties that we have, because there's an interesting acceptance that during that hour or so that we have on a Sunday morning, we're given a lot of liberties when it comes to using copyright. But it's also important to know what those limitations are. Another way that I've used visuals is creating my own imagery. And this was done in the Riverside congregation. This image was for a worship service, and we were talking about safety. And so we created an image with volunteers from the congregation. We invited people who certainly here have a different, a lot of diversity is represented. But the background is also the stained glass of the congregation. And so this would be a very familiar and very actually safe image that they would be quite drawn into. Again, this is what they were greeted with when they came into the worship service. So here you see the letters, the fonts, the image, everything points to a message before I've said or done anything. before music has been played. And so visuals here are very powerful and can be used to convey message all on their own. And of course, that copyright freedom allows us to borrow some imagery that's very, very common in our world. And so this was part of a worship service in which the beginning to the end of the service was using Dr. Seuss's The Lorax to guide us through the service. Again, from beginning to end, everything was the story, of the Lorax. And so this was the image that people, came into and viewed right away. Moving into the invitation of kinesthetics. Most inspiring to me when it comes to kinesthetics is the work of Joanna Macy. In the book, Coming Back to Life, Practices to Reconnect Our Lives and Our World, she offers a number of rituals that really I found appeal deeply to myself and my kinesthetic learning and intelligence, but I've used within congregations to really try to invite those who are deep kinesthetic learners into the service. Now, this isn't to say that these are useful for every service. And so one of the things that my worship arts committee and I had developed over the years was the sense that we had to have some kind of seventh inning stretch, that we needed to recognize the needs of individuals, mostly the 8 and 9-year-olds, mostly 9-year-old boys, but that everyone has a need to move their bodies and be embodied. And so what we would do is somewhere 2/3 of the way into any contemporary worship, we would plan some type of movement. Now, that could have just been the offering. Again, the kinesthetic learner can get a great deal from watching other people move, but kinesthetic learners can also get a great deal from being deeply moved. And so perhaps 2/3 of the way is where we position something that was probably the emotional depth of the worship service, knowing that we were reaching out to those particular kinesthetic individuals. But just to refer back to Joanna Macy, she has some wonderful rituals in which instead of having everyone in the congregation participate, I invited just a few people to act them out, to participate in them, but chose people not necessarily because of their grace, but rather because they reflected the individuals well within the congregation and provided a good sense of the demographic so that people could find themselves in those who were participating and be captured by the movement that was going on around them during different ritual pieces that were taken from Joanna Macy's work. When it comes to music as an invitation, I want to plug October 30th, the last of these small worship for small congregations. And Wendy Bartel, Reverend Wendy Bartel, will be presenting about how we can use music within our worship services. One of the things that has occurred to me over the last 10 years is that there are certain things when I began this I didn't want to do. I didn't want to put up music videos. I didn't want to put up canned music. And over time, I learned to break my own rules as I set them and discovered a great deal of really wonderful expressions and invitations, musical invitations, that at first I was unwilling to even consider. So I want to invite you, if you have an opportunity, to go to YouTube and look up Peter Mayer's music, the song called Holy Now. And take a few minutes, go ahead and even just stop this, go right to that, and get a sense of how a music video, which I myself was quite opposed to when I first began putting technology in worship, but how that particular piece of music is not only quite inspiring, but really does belong in our worship. And if you follow some of those links, you'll see that Peter has wanted that and in fact offers that for a very small donation to him. You can use that piece in worship. And I've used it several different times and found the congregation not only delighted, but deeply drawn into the worship experience. Moving to the logical intelligence and invitation, I'd like to plug it again. The first in this Worship for Small Congregations series, where Reverend Tara Little talked a great deal about the flow of worship and how worship is a continual piece, from beginning to end, thematically, how important that is within our Unitarian Universalist worship. But you can also convey a great deal without words. And in one worship, I invited people to consider their experience of their body and their mind, their hearts, and their experiences of their spirit, that these together can create the sense that there is something more going on in the world. Now, historically, people may have said, no, that's not true. But others have said, yes, that our experiences of body, mind, heart, and spirit have brought us lots of varied imagery, powerful, oftentimes dangerous, but always a sense of something more in the universe and a part of our lives. It's got different forms over the millennia, some of which may seem foreign and others maybe something we want to reject or accept. There's often been just two images, or three, or multiple. In fact, there have been names, many names. The imagery is varied and yet somehow familiar. Ironic, trickster-like, funny, or perhaps comforting even. And it can be strange, we know, and yet also so familiar. Through this sequence, you get a sense of the flow of an idea, a logical flow, and yet the images may even have been juxtaposed and maybe jolting. But this particular process invites people deeply into a meditation, a visual meditation on one hand, but a quite logical meditation of their own experience of the world and the divine. Perhaps one of the best things that I've ever been told about creating thematic worship is recognizing that it's got a beginning, middle, and end, just like any good story. Another piece that I've often come back to is that saying about a sermon: tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, and then tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. A wonderful way to look at an entire worship service. And I recommend the work of the Reverend Erica Hewitt, this book, Story, Song, and Spirit, Fun and Creative Worship Services for All Ages. Erica certainly carries all of those messages about worship through and offers several different types of worship services in which you can just utilize, but also learn a great deal from this approach of carrying a degree of flow through your worship. Looking at tech as an invitation for the interpersonal. One of the ways that I have brought congregations together as a sense and sense their wholeness, their interconnections, is through projection of lyrics. And so simply, here are the lyrics projected. for our spirit of life. And when people begin to sing this, oftentimes they will need a hymnal, even if the words are projected. So I make sure that they're aware of both that they can read from the hymnal and have the notes, and that they can also have the projected lyrics in front of them. Inevitably, by the end of any song, even one as short as Spirit of Life, everyone is looking up. And the experience of singing a song then becomes a communal one, which is very different than singing into a hymnal or feeling attached to a page. Their heads are up, their voices are being sung fully, and the diaphragms are expanded, and they're hearing one another, and they're experiencing their congregation as a whole. There's other ways to bring people together in the interpersonal, but moving to the intrapersonal, that insightful process. You can do surveys. You can invite people to consider a thought or an idea that'll be a part of your theme and gather that information and data weeks ahead of time. Now, as I've already said, there are some really bad ways to present that information back, and that would be, as I showed you, there's so much information in trying to present the data as a whole. So instead, you could simply take all of the responses people have, all that detailed information, and there's a wonderful website that creates word art called Wordle, and it creates something that looks like this. Now, this is the song Spirit of Life. All those lyrics we've just looked at. This takes those and it creates larger font images, words, based on how much that word is used and how central it is. Wordle allows you to create lots of different options out of one piece of text that you put into it. And so it's a way to sort of represent very quickly the key points, and then come and offer your interpretation. So you show the whole in an artistic way, and then you go back and you talk about the top few answers, the most relevant information that came out of congregational surveys. This is very interpersonal because it invites people to consider their own feelings. It invites them to recognize their feelings, their ideas, their thoughts within a whole. And yet it is also interpersonal because it begins to create a sense of community, a sense of the interconnection that we have with one another deeply within our worship. When it comes to linguistic, we're quite skilled at this as Unitarian Universalists. And sometimes I think we even err on the side of being too linguistically involved. Through our readings, whether that's through our spoken word, we often err on the side of the linguistic. And so what I've chosen to do over time is use the linguistic to present a variety of images that, for this worship, for example, the focus was our diversity. And so as people were coming in, they were seeing a change, a slow change in just the word rainbow. Ultimately, the worship turned to talking about how the congregation could participate in an LGBTQ foster parenting program. And so rainbow becomes a very important piece to the entire worship. And here it's being highlighted, but not because we're speaking it. Yes, people are reading it, but because we're providing a different experience, a visual experience of it. Another example is when individuals coming in and saw this, which was the opening slide to an annual bridging service. This was a worship service focused on Green Sanctuary and our environmental justice movement. And we used the order of service in this visual linguistic way also. And at this point, the congregation was right around this time, the congregation went paperless. so we no longer had an order of service that was handed out when people came to service, but rather they learned that throughout the worship service, they would be given the order of service through visuals. So this appealed a great deal to those who were linguistically oriented, and of course created that shared common intrapersonal experience. Another way to share in this was not just to have books copied. Again, the copyright on Sunday morning allows us, current rules, allows us to scan in picture books, project the images as long as we own the source material. Although oftentimes I have contacted artists and authors simply to let them know that I'm going to go ahead and do this, and enjoyed that connection. But you can, for example, this is from Henry Hikes to Fitchburg, recreate the pages. At the same time, someone can be reading over the top of this. And what you get is, instead of the orientation being on that individual reading the book, it's strictly on the images. I've gone as far at times as pre-recording the voice of someone who, during a worship, would feel quite uncomfortable reading or participating, but by themselves, with a script, feel quite comfortable and can do a wonderful recording, and have that recording take place pre-recorded right over the top of some images that I'm showing. So again, using the technology to record people ahead of time and have their participation during a service. Many people have enjoyed sitting through a service where they've been a reader, but they're there to participate and be a part of the worship. And finally, there's the naturalistic. One of the ways that, aside from just having worship outdoors, was this particular worship called Happy Birthday Universe, or Apple Pie Sunday, in which ahead of time we invited the congregation to come with their favorite apple pie recipe. And this gets some explanation, or the logic occurs, when we look at Carl Sagan's famous quote, "If you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe." And so here's a wonderful apple pie recipe and Carl Sagan's advice. But the concept here was that during the worship, because of the close location of the kitchen to the sanctuary, that while we had the apple pies there and were warming up, we could smell the apple pie in the worship. Now, certainly it created a much shorter worship service, as all of us got quite hungry and wanted to rush out and have the apple pie. But it was a way to include our senses. It was a way to invite in that sense of smell. And of course, other traditions have all kinds of ways of doing that. But this invites it in a much more naturalistic way. And there's lots of scents that we can do and be aware of people's allergies, and still have and evoke this naturalistic intelligence and invitation. Another example of this was a worship in which an intern that I had, David Helfer, came out of the Jewish tradition. And in this Passover worship, we had the opportunity to share some of the food. Not everyone was able to take and eat during the actual worship service, but even just, again, the observance of congregation members participating, tasting, their responses were enough to evoke and invite those naturalistic intelligences deeper into our worship experience. Ultimately, technology is an invitation to bring ourselves deeper into worship. And the experimentation that we can do in simply acknowledging that technology is a wonderful medium that we experience every day in our lives, a necessary medium of our daily lives for many of us, and that to leave that out of our worship, to not provide the opportunity for us to bring those things in leaves a portion of us outside our worship walls. But to begin to find ways that that medium, that extension of ourselves, can invite people into worship. And I haven't even myself begun to experiment on how we might tweet together in worship, how we might be able to post together in worship on Facebook or simply on the internet, how we might be able to extend ourselves during worship out into, the internet. There's lots of intriguing ways that we can bring our everyday experience of technology, that tool that extends ourselves, further into worship. But to do it, and I only do it with this in mind, that the technology is the Spirit. One of the things Howard Gardner has done most recently is begun to explore whether there isn't a spiritual intelligence. A spiritual intelligence that really would be something of a keen sense of oneness of spirit. That individuals who have this type of intelligence are invited into those times and spaces where they sense a participation, a harmony with the whole. And as diverse world religions demonstrate, there are many different expressions of that. But each has a unique faith tradition that directs us towards that spirit, that goal. So while all of these intelligences, and feel free to include the spiritual intelligence into this, all of these are wonderful ways to invite people into worship. The goal is spirit. The goal is that harmonious, deeper sense of the whole. And how we can begin to do that, we can begin to take the technology and tools of our everyday worship and bring those together and share those. That ultimately is the goal of our worship. And that is why we can use technology, why we must use current technologies within our worship. Not to be fancy, not to impress people with the wonderful things that we can do, but rather that the goal, that these are the means to a deeper spirit. That technology as an extension of ourselves, as an invitation, can also be a way for us to deepen our sense of the Spirit through invitation, through the mediums, through our own daily experiences that we bring into our worship and cherish together. Well, I very much appreciate your time in listening to this recording of the webinar. And I'd like to close again with a similar reading, if not, pretty much the same reading that we started with, but just a portion of that. And that's with these words by John Ruskin. There is a religion in everything around us, a calm and holy religion in the inbreathing of things of nature. It is the poetry of nature. It is which uplifts the spirit within us until it is strong enough to overlook the shadows. It breaks in and breaks up, link after link, the chain that binds us to materiality and opens our imagination to a world of spiritual beauty and of wholeness. Namaste. Blessed be. Amen.